Then he went on and he said, I say to you, make friends for yourselves with unrighteous mammon, that when it fails, they may receive you into an everlasting home. I've preached on this before, so I'm not going to get into it. But what he's saying is the best thing you can do with money is you can win lost for Christ, and they will greet you in heaven. So you've heard me preach on that before. He calls money, he calls it unrighteous mammon. So then he goes on, I'm going to jump down a few verses, in verse 13, and he says, no servant can serve two masters, for you will either hate one and love the other, or else you will be loyal to one and despise the other. Here it is. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard these things and derided him. So there's a lot going on in this verse, isn't there, about it? And we find out the whole reason he told this parable. Why? Because the Pharisees were what? Lovers of money. And Paul said that the love of money was what? What did Paul say? The root of all evil. The love of money was the root of all evil. Actually, the more literal translation is the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's not the root of all either. There are other kinds of evil, but they're mostly money related. And so what Jesus does here is sort of interesting because he uses the word mammon instead of money or wealth or riches. And the word mammon is an Aramaic word. Now, here's a little context for you. In the days of Jesus, the oral language that people spoke, including Jesus, you might not know this, was Aramaic. They didn't speak Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic. And the written language was Greek. So everything Jesus said was always in Aramaic. And then they translated that, the writers of the gospel translated all those stories and all that dialogue into the written language of Greek. But there's about a dozen places where instead of translating it from Aramaic into Greek, they left the original Aramaic word as it was. And the reason was there wasn't a good translation into the Greek, so they just left it and they quoted it directly as Jesus said it. And I'll give you what the examples are. Hosanna is one of those words. Maranatha is one of those words. Rabbi is one of those words. Abba, Lord help us, was one of those words. When I say Lord help us, I'm referring to that, the pop dancing queen people, I'm not talking about Abba Father. And then, of course, there was this word mammon. And mammon is an interesting word because it doesn't mean money per se. It's the personification of money. So if money was a noun, what mammon is it's a proper noun. It's the name of something that you could worship, that you could serve. Remember, he says you cannot serve both God and mammon. So he puts mammon on the level of God as something you could love and something you could worship. And that was exactly what was going on here, was they were loving money or loving mammon. So he was very careful to use the word mammon. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas comes along. And some of you know him, one of the great Christian minds of all time. And this is what he wrote about it. He said, the sin of avarice is as if mammon being carried up from hell by a wolf coming to inflame the human heart with greed. He called it a wolf. He said it was coming up from hell, and it was coming up to inflame the human heart with greed. In other words, here's what he was saying. Mammon is a monster, and you need to be aware of it. And when we think about what Jesus said about it, it's not too far off.